Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome, everybody. This is another episode of The Examined Life with Phil, and this week I've got a very special guest with us. I've got Zachary Young, who is an adjunct professor out there at... Oh, and I already misplaced my notes, so let me look that up real quick. He's an adjunct professor at River Valley Community College and in the Community College Vermont system. He's got an MA in theology from Asbury Seminary, and he's pursuing an MA in philosophy from my alma mater, Holy Apostles College and Seminary. So, how are you doing today, Zach?
I'm great, Phil. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. Now, I've been excited to have Zach on for quite a while now, because a while back he wrote a particularly great essay that was titled, and again, I misplaced my notes there. It was titled, A Theological Approach to Existential Trauma, Heidegger, Straulla, and Zazalus. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing at least one of those names, so my apologies for that. Yeah. And the reason I got very excited and was looking forward to this, because in this essay, what Mr. Young here does is present a kind of a theory that helps explain why it is that a lot of analytic approaches to the problem of evil aren't very practically useful for people. Why it is when we say come up with a very valid free will defense that explains why God has to allow evil, that doesn't actually help somebody who's going through suffering, which is a question that I'd been wondering about for a while. So I was very excited to read this essay and have Zachary Young on here to talk about it today. So before we get going into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Zach?
Okay, my name is Zach, and I live in Vermont, beautiful state of Vermont, in the Green Mountains here, and I'm an adjunct instructor teaching courses in philosophy, religion, and self and society at a couple campuses in the Vermont Community College system as well as in the New Hampshire Community College system. As a religious studies major in college and a theological studies major in my first grad program, I took quite a few philosophy courses and found much more of an interest in philosophy, say like comparative or historical questions concerning religion. And though these are like certainly interesting and important, I feel I always gravitated towards philosophical things. So like you said, I'm currently a student at Holy Apostles College and Seminary, pursuing my MA in philosophy with the hopes of someday, maybe, possibly doing a PhD somewhere. But I'm getting kind of old, so I don't know if that's actually going to happen. So that's a little bit about me.
Oh, well, and, I'm 36, if that makes you feel better. Or are you older than me?
Yeah, I'm older than you.
Okay.
I'm 39, pushing 40.
Well, I'm starting to feel the pain of that too, so...
Yeah.
All right, good deal. So why don't you tell us a bit about this essay you wrote? What gave you the ideas for writing this? I'm sure you wrote it for a course, but I'm sure there was also some more inspiration than that. So where did the ideas for it come from? And tell us about this essay.
Yeah. So the essay is titled "A Theological Approach to Existential Trauma: Heidegger, Stollerow, and I never know how to pronounce it, and Zazalus, and the Zazalus name that's a hard one. It takes a little practice. I took a course at Asbury Theological Seminary where I have my first MA from, titled Triune Theism. So it's a course with different perspectives on the Trinity, which was extremely interesting.
Oh yeah.
And one of our texts, it's extremely interesting. And one of our texts was John Zazalus' Being as Communion. And I remember, as I'm reading this text, first couple chapters in particular, sensing a really very deep Heideggerian tone in the text, and I started thinking about Zazalus and Heidegger and the problem of evil, and I came up with this idea to kind of use them with this psychoanalytic philosopher named Robert Stollerow as kind of the bridge. So I'd been interested in Heidegger for quite some time. I took a class, there's quite a large continental philosophy interest in my undergrad program amongst the professors. And I took a class, what was it? It was my senior seminar in the religious studies program, and read an essay by Heidegger didn't understand. I think I understood 15% of it. I think now if I went back and reread it, I'd only understand literally 25% of it. But I sensed something really like amazing going on there.
Mm-hmm.
So I just kept trying to understand Heidegger, and I don't completely understand him yet. I mean, I don't know if anyone does. Don't know if he did.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
but there's so much depth and possibility in his thought, especially for theology. And I just had made this connection in my mind about approaching the problem of evil, and I wrote this essay.
Very, very cool. Well, just to get into it a little bit more, why don't you just summarize for us, give us, well, not quite a 200-word abstract, maybe a little more, but what are some of the key points and ideas that you're working with in this essay?
Okay, well, I'm just going to go through and I've got a summary in my mind, and it's kind of lengthy, so you can just stop me along the way and ask the questions as I go.
Yeah, I think that'll be a great approach. Please do that.
Great. So I'll start off with this. So the concision and clarity and ability of what we typically call analytic theologians or philosophers of religion. That stuff is super important, I think. Philosophy is a very important discipline, and analytic thinking is a really important part of that discipline, right? Logic and reasoning and critical thinking, and that's some of the things in my philosophy classes I make sure we study that, we talk about that right up front.
Fantastic.
But I think when it comes to the problem of like gratuitous evil in the world, evil that really shakes to the core or kind of rips into your existence in a way that's just impossible to heal from, then in my opinion, that analytic philosophers and theologians need to consider maybe putting their pens down. And like in the spirit of Wittgenstein, analytic philosopher, the pens might want to fall silent every once in a while. And this is not it's just not a place for logic and reasoning. It's just not a place where that stuff can go. I call these attempts to defend God in these deep instances of trauma, like speculative theodicies.
Oh yeah, that's a good name for them.
Yeah, very speculative theodicies, which I don't mean in a nice way, and which is nothing anyone really wants to hear or read or think about in the midst of or in the aftermath of any kind of traumatic experience or anything.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, please.
Oh, well, I was going to say, yeah, I get the distinction you're making there. I've run into that myself kind of had a slightly different way of explaining it, where when I would read very good analytic Christian philosophers on these topics like Alvin Plantinga and even C.S. Lewis, they would make this distinction between the logical problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil. And then they just push the emotional problem kind of to the side, never come back and deal with it, and then go deal with the logic aspects of it. And most of the time, I would say they did a very good job dealing with the logical aspect, but I always kind of wanted to be like, well, but the real meat of it, where it hits the road and actually hurts people, seems to be more on the emotional side, and you haven't dealt with that. All you've really done is prove that, okay, we can have evil and God, and there's not necessarily a logical incompatibility there. And that's not nothing, but it's not really going to help me understand how to deal with somebody whose, say, 2-year-old daughter suddenly died or something like that.
Correct. Absolutely. And I love Alvin Plantinga. I love reformed epistemology. I love his thinking. But it's like you said, it just doesn't. It's not practical. It doesn't touch anyone's life at all.
Yeah.
Even if we can understand it, which is hard. It's hard to understand deeply analytical, philosophical things. It just doesn't touch that human component. So, but I'm always interested in how philosophy and theology can respond to evil, right? To someone who has moved through evil and trauma and who's really attempting to kind of restore and rebuild their lives. And so, and just no matter how much scripture or theology or philosophy you throw at the problem of evil, there's just no viable justification or explanation in my opinion. There's just none. God's not going to explain himself, and we're not going to make any headway defending God. So let's just stop trying.
Oh, so you would take more of a approach like the book of Job does then, where Job asks all these very great philosophical questions, and God more or less refuses to answer him and says, "Who are you to even ask me this?"
Right. I mean, let's take God seriously and be like, well, okay, let's maybe change our approach. Stop trying to create these speculative theodicies and to explain this, because there's just no explaining it. But there's got to be a different approach. And so with that said, my essay is kind of an attempt to offer this kind of this theological approach.
Okay.
And to intense experience of evil in the world. And here, of course, I think we have to remember that evil is very broadly defined. So yeah. So that's kind of my setup to it. And then, so the big question is, well, how do Heidegger, Stahlerö, and Zizoulis help us do that?
Yeah.
Right?
So get into it. Talk about that a little more.
Okay, cool. So Heidegger gives us a philosophical way of thinking through the effects of deep anxiety on someone's way of being in the world. And first of all, we should say that, just having a brief conversation about Heidegger is not going to do it. Heidegger takes years and years and years of study, and again, I might understand or be able to engage 35 to 40% of his corpus, and really understand it. I mean, people spend lifetimes studying him and extracting things from his thought.
I think you're way ahead of me. I think you're way ahead of me. I'd be surprised if I'm at 5 or 10% of Heidegger. So.
Okay. Okay. So he gives us a philosophical way, I think, of thinking through deep anxiety. So, and in order to understand his ideas here, we have to kind of think through what it means to be in the world. And one of those core ideas to grasp in Heidegger has been illuminated really, really, really well by this Heideggerian scholar named Thomas Shahan. Thomas Shahan teaches at Stanford University and writes some really great articles on explaining Heidegger and just trying to explicate his work. Heidegger is all about ontology, which is being, and so Sheehan argues that being in Heidegger equals meaning. So being equals meaning. That's a really important shift.
Can you for people who aren't as up on how these terms are used philosophically as you and I are, can you kind of define what you mean by the phrase meaning there and being?
Yeah, so what does it mean to be? It's kind of hard to define that.
Yeah.
It's something I think that, and you can help me here, Bill, of course.
I'll try.
What does it mean? It's a super deep metaphysical question.
Yes.
That none of us really can answer. Even the great Heidegger himself can't answer it. What does it actually mean to be? What is it that makes us who we are? All the way from the pre-Socratics to today, people are asking ontological questions. And one of the things that Heidegger does is kind of take this whole question about being as substance and kind of put it into the everyday world of function. And Thomas Shahan looks at Heidegger's corpus and finds that it's even more functional because being actually equals meaning in Heidegger, and of course we can get into that a little more as I go on here.
Yeah.
But
okay.
Feel free to add any explanation of being there.
Well, go ahead.
No, please go.
Okay, I was going to say, you're right that defining what being is actually one of the most fundamental questions you have in philosophy, and that's why it's so difficult. It's one of those terms that's very difficult to define in a strict analytical, non-referential sense. Like I can define for you what a table is without much difficulty, but I can't define for you what being is with much difficulty. I've argued that it's probably the same thing with even some concepts like evil, where it's kind of hard to define it in a strict sense like we can define a table. The best analogy I've come up with to try to help people understand is I said, well, if you think of God and you're thinking of classical conception of God that you get from Christianity and Judaism, you can think of God as being with a capital B. He's the ultimate. And then everything else that's not God, that's created by him, that's contingent on him, has some being, but not to the extent that he does. And you can even categorize that out by a little bit of a hierarchy where you and I, as human beings, have more being than, say, my dog does, because my dog doesn't have, we're in a sense a little bit more like God than my dog is. And some people who are really big dog lovers maybe won't like that, but I'm prepared to stand by that, even though I like my dog. And my dog has even more being than, say, a rock, because a rock is even more removed. And that's the kind of scale conception I've used to try to explain this concept to people, because it's pretty difficult to wrap your mind around if you haven't read gobbles and gobbles of metaphysics. So
Sure, absolutely. And one of the things that Heidegger points out is that we are the only beings that can really think about being, right? We're the only beings that can really, critically analyze what it means to be. So that's just a little something that he points out there, which is very interesting, I think.
Yeah.
To think about that. Kind of goes along with your hierarchical list there.
Yeah, and I wouldn't commit myself to that fully. Maybe I'll change my mind on the hierarchy of it all in another 10 years or so. Yeah. But I think it's just a good kind of analogy to help get people thinking about what we mean by being in an ontological sense.
Sure, absolutely. It's a great one. So Shan argues that being in Heidegger, like what we've been talking about, equals meaning. It actually equals meaning. And I'll read a couple quotes from Heidegger here.
Okay.
That I have here. I can find them. Okay, here they are. That Shan really draws our attention to this as he's trying to kind of convince his readers that Heidegger is talking about meaning. And this is Heidegger. For a long time, I have been designating the being character of human existence as meaningfulness. This being character is the primary one in which the world is encountered. Okay, so meaningfulness is the primary one in which the world is encountered. And then the second quote, this is Heidegger again. Because by its very nature existence is sense-making, it lives in meanings and can express itself in and as meanings. So there you see a little, again, sense-making meanings, human nature, the nature of existence, being equals meaning. Mm-hmm. And then the last quote I have here from Heidegger says, to live means to care. What we care for and about, what care adheres to, is equivalent to what is meaningful. Meaningfulness is a categorical determination of the world. The objects of a world, worldly or world-some objects, that's Heidegger's very strange to read, are lived in as much as they embody the character of meaningfulness. Shan draws our attention to this, and I think it's an important shift. And there's somewhere else that Heidegger explains that when we encounter something like a cup or a chair or something, it's not the chemical makeup that we first encounter, right? But what they mean to us, right? It's not the molecules. It's not the chemical scientific when we encounter a chair, the first thing we see, the first thing we know is that the being of that chair means something for us to sit on, or like the being of the cup means something for us to drink out of. That's the very first thing that we encounter is meaning in the world. And I wish I knew where Heidegger said that, but I don't.
That's all right.
It's meaning. We are makers of meaning. Like the human being walks through the world and makes meaning out of the objects around it, around the human first. We're not considered with just pure being. We're considered with meaning.
So you could. So could we say that this meaning is more like teleological? It's purpose. Like I look at the cup and I don't see it as a ceramic object. Rather, I see it as, oh, that's the thing I just drank my coffee out of.
I think you're absolutely right.
Okay.
And I think you can bring a little Aristotelian, teleology in there.
Mm-hmm.
And Heidegger was so influenced by Aristotle that his work is just saturated with Aristotle.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and so I think that's definitely something that the purpose of this cup is certainly adds to the meaning of this cup, and which is what we encounter. The first thing we encounter is its meaning, its purpose. So yeah.
Good deal.
I think that's what I think that's what Cheyenne is talking about in Heidegger, and I think being equals meaning for Heidegger.
Mm-hmm.
So once we grasp that we're makers of meaning, Heidegger goes on to lead us through in a later essay what it might mean when our meaning making process is disrupted. And now here we're kind of moving into talking about the problem of evil and such.
Yeah.
Which is what I call cognitive disruption. I'm sure, and I have no idea if that's an actual psychological phrase. And everything I say about psychology should not be taken very seriously. Yeah, but I mean, I'm sure someone else has used that phrase somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But just so.
Well, just define it. What do you mean by cognitive disruption?
Right. So I think what I mean by it, and again, I'm not a psychologist, but something we walk through life, and we're having a normal day, we're living our normal life, and we somehow, for some reason, have a traumatic experience, or someone in our life that we know has a traumatic experience, or we've come face to face with evil in the world, and this, I think, sometimes these events where we have these traumatic experiences, where we face evil in the world, are so bad, cause so much pain and so much anguish that our ways of seeing the world, our ways of making meaning out of things, not just objects, but relationships and memories and thoughts and everything, all of that stuff is disrupted.
Okay.
Because of this awful event that has happened to us or to someone we love or something like that, right? So this event just makes its way into ourselves so deeply and so quickly that it just causes this disruptive cognitive experience. And our ways of making meaning in the world are, in a sense, maybe shattered,
So
and I think yeah, go ahead.
So would this be the same or very similar to like what a Kierkegaard would call an existential crisis, where you encounter something in the world that you don't have a framework to deal with, and it throws a lot of things that you've understood previously into whack, because you then have to start questioning a bunch of things that are foundational or that you've taken for granted. Like people who listen to the podcast will remember I talked about one of my own that pushed me into philosophy, like on my first podcast, where I was pushed in by some unjust things that happened to me. I was pushed into questioning, well, does God actually really care about me or not? Where prior to that, I'd just taken that for granted.
Sure.
Is that
Absolutely.
pretty much the same thing or similar? Or?
I think so. Well, I mean, and Heidegger, again, super influenced by Kierkegaard.
Mm-hmm.
If the way you're explaining Kierkegaard, if Kierkegaard says that we didn't have the framework to understand whatever event or whatever we are facing, I think Heidegger would say we have a framework, but the framework is thrown into disarray.
Okay.
Like we built up a a framework of making meaning in the world. We're embedded in context. We're embedded in history. We grow up in certain worlds, familial worlds, church worlds, whatever, spiritual, religious worlds, and that stuff is just kind of shattered, almost in an instant when you experience, like I said, certain really disruptive, traumatic events. And he's got it in a little essay. Well, not little. It's really hard, actually. It's really difficult to understand. But it's called "What is Metaphysics?" I think it's a later essay. I think it falls kind of maybe in his middle period. But I think he hits it right on the head here. And I have a couple of little primary source quotes here.
Okay, go ahead.
And this is Heidegger. Yeah, so this is Heidegger from What is Metaphysics? He says, "Anxiety robs us of speech because being as a whole slips away so that just the nothing," he calls this the nothing, "crowds around. In the face of anxiety, all utterance of the is falls silent." Now, I want to come back to that quote in just a second, but let me read this second one. And this is from the same essay. It says, "Profound boredom," and I think you can read trauma in here, "profound trauma, drifting here and there in the abysses of our existence like a muffling fog, removes all things and human beings and oneself along with them into a remarkable indifference." So two of the things, and I'll just read those two again because they're so wordy and thick, and Heidegger is not the most clear writer.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I'll read these two again. So anxiety robs us of speech because being as a whole slips away so that just the nothing crowds around. In the face of anxiety, all utterance of the is, in quotation marks, falls silent. Second one, profound boredom, or trauma, drifting here and there in the abysses of our existence like a muffling fog, removes all things and human beings and oneself along with them into a remarkable indifference. And so what I think is going, I think he's hitting a very densely true, deep human moment here. And they're just, I think they're so filled with insight into the human condition. Because here we have a reflection on what happens when something has ripped into our lives in a completely disruptive, earth-shattering, being-shattering way. He's saying that all utterance of the is, so everything we think we know, all the meaning that we've built up around the things in our environment, all of that falls silent, right? And that's what anxiety robs us of. So deep existential anxiety robs us of our ability to create an is, to create meaning in our normal, typical environment. And then again, in the second quote that I've read here, profound trauma removes all things and human beings and oneself along with them into a remarkable indifference. So this remarkable indifference is just that. It when we've walked through these really deeply dark periods in our lives, nothing seems to mean the same thing that it used to.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, like we struggle to even understand what God means, or what love means, or what just the basic ways we structure walking through the day. Those things, like, we struggle to do those things, right?
Yes, this actually reminds me of one of the quotes from Nietzsche, where he said that the man who has a why can survive almost any how. And so I think you can. Yeah, I don't like a lot of things Nietzsche said, but I think he was spot on there. And taking what you're saying about Heidegger, it's like, well, if you have a how come in, and you can have a how come in and so disrupt things that you can no longer form the why, and the why is what you really kind of need to even go about living your life. Without the why, you're just kind of going to say, what's the point, and shrivel up and die.
Absolutely. I think Heidegger is pointing out the shattering of the why, for sure. That's a really great way to talk about it, Bill. That's really good.
Oh, well, thank you. I occasionally have a moment or two where I'm kind of coherent, so.
Absolutely. More than a moment or two, I think. So for me, this is where Stollerow comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And Stollerow kind of acts as a bridge between Heidegger and Zuzulus. He both offers some like psychoanalytic support for Heidegger's ideas, and he pushes my essay kind of into the topic of community,
mm-hmm.
which is the bridge to the final part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll kind of move on to Stollerow now, unless there's any more time you want to spend on Heidegger.
No, I think we've covered that pretty well. So yeah, let's move on to the next part.
Okay, so quickly we have to jump back to Heidegger. So
okay.
Heidegger's most important work was Being and Time. So Being and Time, like super important book, changed
mm-hmm.
the course of philosophy, I think forever. And we discussed being, right? Being as meaning, thanks to Thomas Shahan.
Mm-hmm.
But Heidegger is also concerned with the human being's temporal nature, right? So
mm-hmm.
we're time-bound beings.
Yes, definitely.
Hence the name Being and Time for his main work. So Stollerow, who is also a Heideggerian, and Stollerow actually has a PhD in psychology and a PhD in philosophy.
Oh, wow.
I don't know how one actually does that in their life,
mm-hmm.
but he seemed to do it, and he's a brilliant thinker. And he highlights both the human's temporal nature and comments kind of, and in the spirit of Heidegger, on the disruption that trauma causes to this temporal nature that humans have. And that's our normal way of making meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what Stollerow does, I think, is really pinpoints what Heidegger is trying to get at, both in Being and Time, both when he writes about anxiety in Being and Time and what is metaphysics. And I have some quotes here I'll read from Stollerow, and you'll probably be able to hear his kind of deeply Heideggerian tone here.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll read those from Stollerow, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so here's Stollerow. Experiences of trauma become freeze-framed into an eternal presence in which one remains forever trapped. In the region of trauma, all duration or stretching along collapses. Past becomes present, and future loses all meaning other than endless repetition. Right? So and this is still Stollerow. In this sense,
mm-hmm.
it is trauma that is timeless. And then he goes on. Because trauma so profoundly alters the universal or shared structure of temporality, the traumatized person quite literally lives in another kind of reality, an experiential world incommensurable with those of others.
Mm.
This felt incommensurability, in turn, contributes to the sense of alienation and estrangement from other human beings that typically haunt the traumatized person. Torn from the communal fabric of being in time,
mm-hmm.
trauma remains insulated from human dialogue.
Mm.
So, end quote. So I think that those are just two profoundly accurate and kind of extremely Heideggerian ways of expressing the human beings, the mode of human beings as they've walked through trauma.
Yeah, I remember when I was reading your essay, that was a part that's really struck me, this idea that people who are experiencing this severe form of trauma, existential trauma and existential crisis, that you have to think of them mm-hmm. like they're in a whole nother system of being, like they're in a whole nother way of life. And part of the reason it struck me so much, like we talked about earlier, is that I'm like, well, that suddenly explains why it is that all these analytic responses to the problem of evil, all these theodicies that seem to work so well that I can't find any flaw with, why it is that they don't help these people, because they're not, I'm operating in a completely different system than they are. Maybe it might be a little unfair to say they're being irrational, but you could say they're being irrational, where rationality doesn't even necessarily come into play. And that's assuming that the theodicies I'm talking about actually are rational and right, which is a whole other question. But even assuming they are,
sure.
That then explains why it is they don't work, why it is they don't help these people like I want to say they should.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Phil, your commentary on this stuff is so good.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
It's so right on.
Well, you wrote a great essay, and I'm giving great commentary on it, so we're just having a good time all around.
We are. So Stallero goes on after those two quotes, and he kind of makes it. As far as my essay is concerned, I really use this to kind of move toward the communal aspect of it, where Zedulus obviously comes into play later. But here's another quote from Stallero. Although the possibility of emotional trauma is ever present, so too is the possibility of forming bonds of deep emotional attunement, within which devastating emotional pain can be held, rendered more tolerable, and hopefully even eventually integrated. Right? Stallero labels this approach in his text kinship in the same darkness, or kinship in finitude. And in my opinion, this really opens the door for theology, especially the kind of theology that Zedulus is offering in Being as Communion. So I think so what we have so far, in my opinion, is a solid philosophical understanding of what happens to someone who's been affected by evil in the world, with Heidegger. Again, where evil is broadly defined. And then Stallero kind of moves us by, kind of excavating Heidegger just a little bit, putting it in some more, in some terms that we can actually understand, and orienting it around emotional trauma, and then moving us toward the possibility of community and the communal nature of people being the place where healing can possibly happen.
Okay.
So that's kind of a summary up to halfway through my paper.
Okay, so he's suggesting that when somebody who's going through this existential trauma is in a community of people, a good, solid community, and we can define that a little later, that's something that's going to help pull them out of the trauma and essentially pull them back into the regular system, the regular way of being that is what we all want.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think that's exactly what Stallero was saying. And so I kind of take that and see what adding a little Zedulus, a little ecclesiology, and can do for us there.
Okay.
So Zedulus' main text is called Being as Communion. So Being as Communion, which should really give us a big hint as to what he's going to argue for.
Oh yeah.
And to begin to understand what he's working toward, I think we should probably step through some terminology. So like God as person, that's one. So personhood. Biological versus ecclesial being, those are two major things to grasp in Zedulus. And then his thoughts on the Eucharist, which thoughts on the Eucharist kind of move us allow us to then talk about some like eschatological, the importance of eschatology, which we'll get to in just a second. So as we move through thinking about God as person, which is our first thing that we have to think about in Zedulus, a couple theological issues arise that I don't want to spend time on, but like things like the Theological clause and regenerational baptism, both are extremely controversial, both of which we could argue about here until the cows come home. But I would argue that both these issues can be sidestepped in Zedulus, and I certainly don't want to spend any time, getting too much into them. But I think what we need to do is trust that his main points are points that we can learn from, and that we can allow whatever theological team we play for, which is hopefully all in the end the same team.
Yeah.
That there will be points and ideas that will be useful for us for thinking about this. So those two things I mentioned are things that if this maybe was a theology podcast, we could really dive into. But I'll just move on.
Okay, I think that's wise at this point.
Okay, good. So he argues in Being as Communion that God is personal, right, as opposed to static, immutable being, right? So, and at first this seems obvious, but I don't think it is for a lot of folks. We hear about God's immutability all the time, that he's the strong rock that never changes, and that God is just unchanging rock of all things. And I think this draws our attention so much into the idea that God is first and foremost impersonal substance, but that his personality grows or emerges out of this or something. And I think that might be dangerous. You know, a little way too much Platonic and Aristotelian influence there. So what Dualist argues is that God's Trinitarian nature, when taken seriously and pondered deeply, doesn't really allow any space for static substance, for God to be defined as some static being, right? So God as Trinity must mean God as community. Right? So God as Trinity, God as person, as Trinity, must mean God as community. So I think it's the big thing for Zazulus.
Yes, I like that so much. That's one of the things that I've always found so appealing and just seems so right about the Christian conception of God as opposed to other ones, is that only with the Trinity do you get the idea that there's relationship from the beginning, that the fundamental of reality is relational. It's not singular.
Absolutely. At the bottom of all things, right? God's
exactly.
nature, there's relationship, there's community. There's not static substance, not the unmoved mover. You know, bless the unmoved mover's heart. But it's community. It's at the bottom of all metaphysical anything.
As much as I like Aristotle, that's a point where he was just wrong. So
I think you're right. So my question is always, you know, as we think about trauma, as we think about someone moving through the night of trauma, would we want to bring them into a community with substance or personhood at the center? I think we want personhood, right?
So let me stop you for 1 second. Could it be that we could have both? Like, is substance and personhood like necessarily opposed to each other there?
I think as long as and again, this is, you know, we're going to split theological hairs, but like as long as the ground, you know, to use a phrase from Paul Tillich, which I probably shouldn't do on a you know, but as long as the ground of being is not like the ground of God is not substance first and personhood second. I think it's fine to think both.
Okay.
But if God is indeed Trinitarian, right? Then, and if relationship is at the bottom of all things, then I don't think it's possible to place substance, to place static, immutable being in at first. I think it's relational personality first.
Okay.
It's hard for me to get past that. Does that make sense?
I was mostly curious how you'd respond, because as I'm sure you're aware, there's quite a big fuss isn't exactly the right word because everybody's very polite about it, but between people who are classical theists who tend to think of God in much more of a static way, although they resist the idea that he's so static he's Aristotle's unmoved mover, and then the people who are typically called like theistic personalists who tend to think of God in a much more personalistic way. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a Reformed thinker named John Frame, who I think this is his term. I think he coins the term absolute personality. Maybe he hasn't coined the term or wherever it is, but it's God is absolute personality. I'm sure that's a great debate that's happening.
You've been going to Holy Apostles for a while too. Most of the classical theists tend to also be Thomists, and since Holy Apostles is a Catholic school, a lot of people there tend to be Thomists, and that's how I became aware of this distinction. And I haven't quite made up my mind on it yet, because I think they can both muster some pretty decent arguments. Like you just gave I think a pretty exceptionally good argument there for thinking that God is fundamentally personal, and I really feel the force of that, and I kind of want to say, But then I know my Thomas friends who listen to the podcast are going to come back and say, well, what about this argument and this argument and this argument? So,
yeah, right. Well, it makes for good conversation.
It absolutely does. That's why I enjoy it so much.
Good fellow. So God is personhood. We'll pretend that that's the case.
Mm-hmm. We'll grant it for the sake of conversation right now.
Right. And we are made in the image of this personhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now onto the difference between how Zazoulas characterizes human being as biological, ecclesial, and Eucharistic. I think this is where the real theology starts to happen here. So a biological way of being in the world for Zazoulas describes how someone is as they're born into the world, right? Their way of living life and all its complexity from birth on, but without the presence of or entrance into the church, right? So without the power of the Spirit, without this transformative power of the Spirit. When someone enters into the community of the church, into this transformative power, this is when they take on ecclesial being, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the biological way of being in the world and the ecclesial way of being in the world. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Now, yes, we're going to get into some metaphysics here, and I don't think we need to fear metaphysics, even though sometimes we tend, some philosophers of religion tend to do that these days in the postmodern world.
I think that's a mistake.
Because I think we need some metaphysical power to fight against, to make some good arguments against theologians and philosophers of religion who want to meet evil with logic.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So, which is kind of bad to say, but whatever. Ecclesial existence is a result of the entrance into the koinonia, right? So the communion of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And the very important thing of what Zazoulas is trying to say here is this is not symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
It's a super deep ontological shift that happens within the person, who becomes embedded in koinonia, who enters into this transformative power of the Spirit. We move from biological being to ecclesial being, and it's not sometimes you go to some Protestant churches and they say that the bread and the wine are symbols.
Mm-hmm.
It's a symbolic act, but that is not what Zazoulas is saying. He's saying that it's deep ontological shift in our being.
Mm-hmm.
When we take on ecclesial being, that's a big deal. And again, I'll read a little thing from Zazoulas here.
Okay.
He says, from a fact that a human being, and this is from Being of Communion, from a fact that a human being is a member of the church, he becomes an image of God. He exists as God himself exists. He takes on God's way of being. This way of being is a way of relationship with the world, with other people, and with God. It is an event of communion. And that is why it cannot be realized as the achievement of an individual, but only an ecclesial fact. So that's kind of summarizing what I was saying about this kind of deep ontological shift.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm following you right here. So because God is foundationally person in relation, at least one of the ways we become a little bit more like God, we get more of this being, is through communion or the through communion or the Eucharist. And because God is so foundationally relational, then the communion and the Eucharist has to come in relation as well. It's not something we can just go do by ourselves because that doesn't fit.
Absolutely.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yep. So biological being, ecclesial being, and then the Eucharistic being. He moves into this, right? So the Eucharist for Zazoulas is where ecclesial being functions, right? It's where it lives and moves, which is, I think, is an important thing to realize. And here's another quote, a short one. the Eucharist, and this is again from being as communion, the Eucharist is foremost an assembly, a community, a network of relations in which man and women transcends every exclusiveness of a biological or social kind. Okay, so we think of the Eucharist as just maybe this act of sharing in Christ's body and blood, but Lewis is kind of reshaping that or rethinking it. An assembly, a community, a network of relations in which man and women transcends every exclusiveness of a biological or social kind. Okay, so does that make sense? And that's kind of where the Eucharistic way of being is where the ecclesial way of being kind of makes its way out into the world.
Okay.
And then here comes another important term. It then goes on to explain the importance of the eschatological dimension that is allowed into play here. So ecclesial being, the way that Zulus works with it, in my opinion, is revolutionary, right? And this eschatological dimension adds even more possibility for someone affected by evil to find some kind of peace or normalcy. So, because we move from the biological way of being to the ecclesial way of being, which is born within the Eucharist, which in a redefined way is an assembly or community or network of relation. Then we have this. Then we're moved into a new way of thinking, a new eschatological, hopeful way of thinking, right? Eschatology, as a Christian theologian understands it, is infuses us with hope. So, and again, remember, we've come from Heidegger through Stollerow, who had put so much emphasis on the community as the place of healing, and now Zulus is kind of theologically infusing the community as a way to find not just kinship and finitude like Stollerow argues, but I think he's moving towards maybe actual, really close to finding real restorative healing, right?
Okay.
Because of this eschatological dimension that is ushered in through the ecclesial Eucharistic way of being. So I know that's a lot. I know I just said a lot of stuff there.
Yeah.
But there's a really young, brilliant theologian named Andrew Root. I don't know if you've heard of him.
I have not.
Have you?
No, I have not, no.
Okay. Every single listener you have should read Andrew Root. I don't care if they're Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, or whatever.
Okay. I'll try to find him then.
He's a professor at Luther Seminary. I'm not sure I can say Luther on a Catholic podcast, but I did. But he's a professor there. He's a brilliant thinker. He's a young guy. He's just extremely, extremely brilliant, practical theologian. And he writes some really good stuff on eschatology that I think folds right into this, and that I actually end my essay with. So here's a quote from Andrew Root. Eschatology is the study of the last things, but at its core is the hope that God will move to bring forth ultimate possibility next to what feels like ultimate nothingness. To study eschatology is to seek the promise that God is acting to transform possibility into an actuality of love and peace, a reality in which the nothingness that seems always to be threatening us is eliminated forever. Okay? And here it is, I think. I think Zulus paves the way for Root's claims here. So ultimate possibility next to ultimate nothingness is what leads to restoration. In the aftermath of really devastating trauma, in the aftermath of us facing, the worst kind of problem of evil in the world. And the church is where this is found. Not in some symbolic way. Remember, that's Zulus' big point, but in a very real, substantive, metaphysically rich way. Sorry to the postmodernists, but like real, substantive, metaphysically rich. Heidegger and Stollerow kind of help us understand the issue, and Zulus opens the way for theology to do some really good restorative work with a little help from Andrew Root.
Yeah. You don't ever need to apologize to postmodernists on my podcast. If you go listen to the first one, one of the things that drove me into philosophy was I was doing stuff in English because I love stories, and I came across postmodern criticism, and it was so inanely stupid that it drove me out of English and into philosophy. So.
Oh, gotcha. I gotcha. I mean, there are some good postmodern thinkers out there. I'm not, there's some good, really brilliant thinking going on.
Oh yeah, I'm not going to say that they never have any point or that people shouldn't read them or things along those lines. Actually, postmodernism tends to be quite a bit better in philosophy than it was in English and literature studies. It gets absolutely crazy there.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I bet. But yeah, just, real substantive, metaphysically rich way of thinking that Zulus really, I think, ushers us into. And that's kind of the all too long summary of my essay.
Okay. Well, first of all, as I said, great essay. There's a number of really, really great ideas there. I think I already said this, but the part that really, really strikes me that I really like is what you've done is essentially given a framework or a theory that explains this apparent disconnect between the logical problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil. And that's something I'd always wondered about, to the point where I actually wrote a couple of philosophers who make that move, where they make the distinction between the logical and emotional problem of evil and then just push the emotional one off the side. And I'd say, well, why are you doing this? Where's your justification for doing this? And none of them ever wrote me back. So, but
that's so strange.
Yeah. But the other thing that I really like about it is I think it can give people your theory isn't just like this abstract theory that's sitting out there and doesn't seem to do anything, but it gives you then a framework for understanding, well, what do you do about it? If your friend, their child dies really young or something horrible like that, well, what do you do about it? Well, if community is the answer, then you need to be in community with them, or you need to find a way to help them be in community with them and sort of bring them back. Does that sound like a good application of what you're saying there?
Absolutely. And I think if I was going to, there would be so many things I would want to do differently with this paper had I had time. And if I ever take this paper and kind of expand on it for a thesis or dissertation or something somewhere along the line, I'm really, entering into the, practical ways of actually burying this out in the world. And what, I think with the Zulus and Root and how they've really given us this rich theological, bed to, the foundation to stand on, then there's so much to talk about what that actually means practically.
Yeah. And that's one of the other things I really liked, and one of the things I'm trying to do on this podcast is, not strictly speaking, make philosophy practical again, but kind of like that, because I've gone to quite a few philosophy conferences and I read a lot in the academic journals, and so much of it is just very abstract with little or no tie to reality. And when you go back and read the great philosophers, they were very, very tied to reality. Even when you go read Aristotle's Metaphysics, it's metaphysics, but it's very tied to reality. He isn't just doing abstract and esoteric theories that have little bearing on what's actually going on in the world, which, in my experience of academic philosophy now tends to be very much in the other direction, where you could go to a conference, maybe have a good time, seeing if you can out-logic each other, but it's virtually nothing that goes on there is going to have an effect in your life.
Yeah, absolutely, which is frustrating.
Yes, very much so. Because it shouldn't be that way. Philosophy should be the art of figuring out how to live life well and finding what's true.
Absolutely, I think doing philosophy at a seminary, it's good for that. I was able to focus on a philosophy of religion a lot at Asbury Seminary, and being in the seminary context is really, that really it helps you stay focused on the practical, even after, taking all the abstract heady stuff and really funneling it in to practical ways of being in the world. So.
Yeah, that's great. So, I'm trying to formulate my thoughts here real quick. One question I did have, I thought you made the jump in the essay from community to it's the Eucharist rather quickly. I think you explained it a lot better here in the podcast than you did on the essay, actually. But one of my thoughts I have is, could community that's not tied to the Eucharist maybe serve a similar function of bringing people back from their existential crises. Like, say you have a really good family with little or no dysfunction, but they're not involved in a church. And I realize I'm making an assumption that that's even possible when I say that, but just for the sake of argument, would that be able to function in a similar way for helping people, or any other community you can think of like that?
Absolutely. And
okay.
I think Stellaro is a great person to read.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's an atheist, and he writes on this topic, and he's so he's just so on. He's so accurate. He understands the human condition so well, and I think so to answer your question, yes, I definitely think that this can be done outside of the church, but when it's done inside of the church, there's so much more possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Because of what I've argued here.
Yeah, and that would be because God, being with a capital Being, is going to be found more readily and easily within a church community setting than he is somewhere else that's not tied to the church. Is that about right?
Right.
Okay.
Yes, but I definitely let me just make clear, I definitely think God is found outside the church in all kinds of places. But there's something about that koinonia, right? There's something about that that non-symbolic communion, that deeply ontological shift that happens, within a church setting and among people, So and I wouldn't want to make any major. So I think you summarized that well there. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, and I'd agree with you there that definitely a church setting is the best place. I've met some Christians who, would affirm Christ and believe, and they would, so to speak, say all the right things, but then never go to church, and they almost inevitably run into problems. I've never been aware of somebody who's done that where it's actually worked out for them. And so even if I don't have a well-developed philosophical or theological theory to explain that, practically speaking, I think the fact that that's how people who avoid the community of the church end up, that's something that should give us pause.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, as I said, great essay. Do you have any other concluding thoughts on it or something like that?
Read Heidegger, Stellaro, and Zazula as much as you can. Good stuff. That's it. So I thanks for taking the time to talk to me about it. It's been great to kind of dive back into it, because I had written this paper a couple years ago, and so it's been really good to kind of be reminded of this stuff.
Okay. Well, yeah, and thanks for coming on. I really enjoyed our discussion here. Do you have any things you want to plug, like a blog or a podcast or anything like that? Or if people wanted to find out more information about you, is there a place they could go?
No, not really. I don't really have anything like that yet, but come take some classes in the New Hampshire and Vermont community college systems.
I actually had the thought earlier. I was going to kind of sign off by telling people, hey, if you live there in Vermont near one of these places, go take a class from Zach Young here. He obviously knows a great deal about what he's talking about. I'd maybe audit a class of yours or two if I lived nearby you.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Okay. Thanks for listening this week. Be sure to write in and let me know what you think about Zach's essay, what his theory of how existential trauma works and how we use community to pull people out of that. Tell me about some experiences you've had that were like that, and how you might have helped other people. Or, if you disagree with anything we've said here, write in and tell me about that too. So thanks for listening.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.